Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. It's good to be with you all today. Can you hear me okay? Does that sound good? Yeah, I've been involved in following the global markets for well over 15 years now, and I remember years and years ago, one of the first trips that I took to China was with Don and Phil here. And that was a long time ago, wasn't it? And so as part of my work, I spend a lot of time on the road. And no, I have no trip scheduled to China anytime soon. That's not... I was planning to be there this month. I looked, and this month or next month, I said I've got to be there. And fortunately, I didn't get a plane ticket booked. So I'm just going to have to keep reading online what's happening in China for now, because I'm not going over there. It's an interesting time. It's interesting markets. I look through and reread what I was talking about a year ago. And you think back a year ago, we didn't know much. The ASF was just a big, vague, opaque mystery. And the Chinese government was still burying cases. I remember I was over there in January, and I was absolutely shocked to hear the China Swine Association suggest that a third of China's hogs were gone in January. But that news, it was pretty slow to come out. And so it's been a wild year of anticipation and trying to understand what does China mean, how many hogs really are gone, how high are the prices going to go, and when does it matter. And I've had to remind some of my clients, fortunately my job isn't to forecast the market price. My job is to tell you what's going on in China. And I look back from where we were a year ago, and China has far exceeded my expectations in how much pork they're buying from the U.S. Those volumes are absolutely huge now. Problem is, we've just outproduced that event. And there's a saying, highly anticipated events never happen, right? And there might be some truth to that for this group, that this was a highly anticipated event, and due to the fantastic innovation, productive nature of our hog farmers, we are just flat out producing, at least to this point, what China can buy from us. That's my nutshell version. So I want to talk a little about ASF in China, beyond China, talk about U.S. pork exports, where China is in this market, talk about the Phase 1 deal, and my export forecasts, and then we'll talk about coronavirus and some of these other things. But it really is an incredible situation. This is such a unique virus, African swine fever, and a lot of people don't realize ASF is not a highly contagious disease. It's not even classified as highly contagious. But when we saw that first case reported in China, knowing what the Chinese infrastructure is for hog production, it didn't matter. We knew this was going to be a massive game changer. The three things to consider really, the virus is very strong. It's a very hard to kill virus. And while it's not highly contagious, it can last a long time. The virus can last up to 3 years in frozen meat. You can pull that meat out of the cooler, thaw it out, test it, and the virus is still active. It's incredible. In infected pens in China, they were saying 60 days. Some people say 30 days. They're still infected. In wild boars in Europe, you can find dead boars in the forest, go crack the bones open, test the marrow, positive for ASF. And so as those boars feed on dead boars, it perpetuates it. But it's a really strong virus. It's a hardy virus. Mortality rates approach 95%. So pretty much everything that gets it dies. And the real kicker is there's no vaccine. So in any global hog disease, when you look at that scenario, that's a major problem. And what a blessing that it's not highly contagious. It would be absolutely unstoppable. And now it's just unstoppable in China, in Asia, Philippines, some of those countries. But remember, Russia went through African swine fever and has largely been able to live with it. And it is survivable. The biosecurity measures we have here ensure that we would probably be pretty successful pretty quick with ASF. The problem is our export markets would all be closed. We'll talk a little more about that. But these are the real kickers that make this such a game changer. Now with China has roughly half of the world's hogs, Europe has 25%. This thing is knocking on the door now of Western Europe. It's actually in Belgium. It's very close to Germany. So we have 75% of the world's swine herd now affected by a disease that's 95% fatal and has no vaccine. Pretty sobering thought to think about. China pork is 20% of the global meat and poultry supply. So anything that affects Chinese pork is going to affect the global protein. Beef, poultry, everything. And the losses in China and Vietnam are absolutely massive. How bad is it? The Chinese government showed their low water mark in October. They said that their inventory was down 40%. They showed an October slaughter number, which is not very representative, but they said it was down 46%. Now they're claiming that their herds are increasing. They're claiming recovery. Now they may have had some slight recovery. Hog profits in China have been over $300 a head for 4 or 5 months now. I hate to even tell you that. Is that like... That's a little salt in the wound, right? But what happens when you have hog profits of $300 a head? Nobody in here knows, do you? We would have hogs running down the streets of Colombia if we expand even when hogs don't make money, we expand. Hog profits hit $300 a head, you'd have hogs everywhere. What happens in China when you're having, say you're having 30, 40, 50% death loss, you start breeding your market gilts. You start breeding everything, and that's what they're doing. They're breeding their market gilts. So their sow herd number may be increasing. The problem is the death losses are still out of control. I talk to private sources in China in the feed, pharma, equipment, genetics industry, and I say, how bad is it? It's pretty easy to get a number 70, 80% down from those guys. They're just saying our sales are down 70, 80% from a year ago. I don't know how bad it is. Our estimate is that 65% of the herd is gone. And that may be a little conservative. But even at that level, that's a third of the global swine herd now dead. A third of the global hogs are now gone. Incredible, right? So, China, the hog prices are stable at very high levels. Right now, converted into US dollars, they're as high as they've ever been. They're even back above those November peaks. And this is post-Chinese New Year. Now, there is coronavirus. There's some other things we'll talk about. ASF losses continue. They don't have this thing even close to whipped. They're still having cases. The government occasionally will announce a case, but you talk to consulting vets over there, people on the ground, there's still ASF cases happening all the time. Coronavirus. This is a major wild card. Some people are saying that's why prices are record high. I said, no, I think it's because 2/3 of your pigs are gone is why prices are record high. But there are some logistics issues. Imports are soaring. China's now buying $2.1 billion a month of beef, pork, and poultry. So to put that in perspective, in 2018, Japan was the biggest meat and poultry importer in the world. They were buying $1 billion a month, and they were biggest in the world. China's now buying over $2 billion a month. Now buying 9% of U.S. production, based on my estimates. A year ago, they were buying 1%. 8% of production now going to China. What's our year-over-year production growth? About 9%. There's our problem, right? Tyson JBS are now racto-free, starting to increase. Those volumes are going to go up from 9%. We're going to have more than 9% going. Let's talk about coronavirus for a minute. This is talk about black swan upon black swan. And somebody in China was writing about black vultures. They were calling black vultures, not black swan. Maybe that was a translation thing, I don't know. But the spread potential remains completely uncertain. We just have no idea now. It's a weird situation. Something's going on that I don't understand because this has infected Wuhan horribly. Wuhan and Hubei province have just been obliterated with it. It has not caught fire really anywhere else. Even Hong Kong, you'd think Hong Kong's had less than 100 cases. All the other provinces in China, if you add up the deaths, 96% of the deaths are still in Hubei province, where Wuhan is. I don't know if it was in the water there. I have no idea, but it's odd that it just spread like wildfire in that city and just really doesn't take hold anywhere else. The Chinese population infected, 0.3, hundredths, thousandths of a percent, is that right? Thousandths of a percent. Chinese deaths, I won't even try that. 0.0001% of China's population has died from this. So those are pretty small rates. The mortality rate's only 2%. 2% of the people getting it are dying. So you look at this and go, it's not terrible. The flu in the U.S. is about 0.1%. About 0.1% of people that get the flu die every year in the U.S. This is a 2%. But look at Spanish influenza. In 1918, it was 10% fatal. 10% of the people that got it died. The problem was 500 million people got it. 50 million people died. And so that's the fear with something like coronavirus. It's very low mortality. I don't know. It just has not, for whatever reason, knock on wood, it has not caught fire anywhere outside of central China. There have been cases all over the world, but very, very few. You look at the chart on the right there. This was through yesterday, and you can kind of see they're starting to maybe plateau. That was the one-day increase yesterday in cases. That's the number of cases in China. At some point, this thing's going to start to plateau. Who knows? There's lockdowns. Think about it, though. They've locked down 50 million, 57 million people in China live in a city that's now under a lockdown. 57 million sounds like a lot. In China, that's 4% of the population. So 96% of the population is not locked down in China. Now they are, but they're on a voluntary lockdown. The streets of Beijing and Shanghai are now kind of ghost towns. There's not many cars, not much happening there as well. But again, those cities have only had hundreds of cases, not tens of thousands like Wuhan has. I don't know. Interesting. I think we're going to start to see this thing slow down. Food concerns are not really a problem. Early on, that was a question. People are getting food. I see a lot of videos out of China. People in grocery stores. The grocery stores are stocked. The problem is if you go out and buy food for 1 week at a time in China, you're not buying a lot of pork. Now, on the flip side, there's not a lot of pork to buy even if you wanted to. But the food's getting through. The Chinese government is moving product. The question is about ports. And we do have some backlogs in ports. I know of 2 ports in China now that say we have no more plugs. A plug is what you need to plug in a refrigerated container when it offloads off a barge. 2 of the ports are out of plugs. They're rerouting some product. I heard there's some product being offloaded in Busan, Korea. They're just going to plug it in and hold it until those Chinese ports clear. Now this is a bit of a problem. I don't think it's a widespread problem yet. But you get a little bit of pushback, and it starts to flow even back here to the U.S. ports and to the U.S. cold storage. We aren't an industry that has a lot of cold storage. We're a fresh meat industry. And so a little bit of a blip really starts to push hard here. It's going to be pretty critical the next 3 weeks to get this stuff moving. Because if we have continued backlogs, we're going to start to feel that pain a little more. So there's where we are. There's the China live hog price. Last Friday it was 38. Overnight last night it hit 39. So the highest it ever went was 41. Now I remember back in January of a year ago trying to guess where this thing was going, and we were placing bets on how high it could go. And we were assuming this thing was really bad in China. The price, we were sitting there in 2019, prices were around 12 to 15 RMB. The record high was 21.8. And I wish Damu was here. I'd feel better picking on him if he was here. But Damu always wants to bet on prices. And we said, where are we going to be, Damu? And he said, you pick a price and I'll take the over or under. That's how he always wants to bet. And so I said, I think it's going to go above 28 or 26 RMB. And he said, I'll take the under. And the way Damu bets is because he says, if I'm wrong, that's good for business, right? So he's hedging his bet even on his bet. So he took the under. So that's one of the few bets I've ever won with Damu. But I was thinking 26, 28 would be a high price. And we went right to 41 before we knew what was going on. These prices are extremely high. To show you how high they are, here's what U.S. hogs are. If we had U.S. hogs in China, they would be 9.5 RMB today. So you look at this and go, why is this not working, right? Why are they not buying every pound we can produce? Well, it's complicated, and I've walked through that calculation, but this is a fresh pork price. That's the price of fresh carcasses in China. Frozen carcasses are discounted, 20, 30% in some regions. They don't like frozen pork. And so you put that discount on, then you add our tariffs, then you add our freight. Now, it still works. The math works. It's just not quite as extreme as it looks here. But they really can and should be buying more than they're buying today. Again, logistics may be the bottleneck here in the short term. On a global basis, this is a monthly price converting everybody into dollars per hundredweight. There's where China is right now. Look at that. The Japanese are very concerned. If you've seen the bookings, the Japanese pork bookings the last couple weeks, their bookings are almost triple what they were a year ago. They have realized China can now outbid us for pork. China can outbid anyone in the world for pork right now. That's a very concerning prospect for Japan that consumes 50% of imported pork. Half the pork they eat is imported. If we take everyone off and just leave China and the U.S. on, that's the depressing, miserable chart that we have today. That's our 201 price. You can see where we are. You can see where China is. Absolutely incredible. Now, in my opinion and in my history of analyzing export markets and global markets, is the market's job is to close spreads, right? That's what markets do. People arbitrage trade all over the world, whether it's corn, soybeans, or whatever. The market's job is to close spreads. Now, I don't know how and where this spread closes, but I know there's not enough globally traded pork in the world to significantly reduce the price of Chinese hogs. There's just not enough anywhere, and so the spread means prices are going to go towards that. The question is politics, production, a lot of these other things. Here's what the EU has seen out of this. Now keep in mind, the U.S. is the only major production base that's been expanding aggressively for the last year. The EU's not expanding. Not even now they're not expanding. But you can see the politics of their world. They got banned by Russia over ASF. When Russian ASF came into Europe, Russia banned them, knocked the price down. Then we had that little blip in 2016 when China bought. And here's ASF. Some of the highest prices ever across Europe. But again, they're not expanding. They didn't expand 10% production over the last 3 months like we did. Here's what the market prices show in China. If you're walking through the streets of China looking at the price of pork in the markets, pork prices are up 100. I think the last week was right around 116, 120%. 1.4 billion people feel that every day of the week. The average Chinese person eats pork every day of the year, or used to. They don't now. I've seen some videos on social media, some people talking about it. One guy said, I haven't eaten pork in 6 months. And that's a guy that ate pork every day of the year before this happened. The shortages are pretty severe. But even beef, look at that beef price. That's over $5 a pound U.S. now. Incredible. All those little blips you see on the beef price, that's Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year's when they'd get the peak price. But poultry's a little interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute. How bad do they hate poultry? Even when pork prices go up to 50 RMB, they still won't. I've got a slide that shows it a lot better than that here in a minute. The shortages are real. Social media tells that people on the ground, they're like, you've just not seen pork in the marketplace. You just can't find it anymore. The government claims they've released inventory. I think I added up somewhere around 200,000 tons they've released from frozen inventory. That's 400 million pounds, 450 million pounds, which equates to about 5 ounces for every person in China. I mean, frozen inventory is not big enough to move the needle on prices. Maybe in one city, but not nationally. The food inflation is through the roof. But think about it. Consumer pressure is different there. If we had a problem like this, one of our main food staples was in tight supply, we would have every politician in the world standing up saying, we're going to fix this. No offense to politicians, but we're going to fix this, right? But the difference in China is nobody's running for re-election. And I'm serious here. The government looks at this and goes, yeah, this is a tough situation. It's going to be a tough situation for a while. And in the end, this probably plays into China's national strategy of saying, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. In 10 years, we're probably going to be better off because of this. We're going to have a newer industry, a bigger hog industry, more capital intensive, more progressive industry. I just don't think they're too concerned about fixing this. We always think, how do you fix the problem? I'm not sure they're really super concerned about fixing the problem. The only pressure in China is peasants in the streets with pitchforks, right? And I don't think this is going to cause that. There's their inflation rates. So the red line is pork inflation, 127%. The green line on this other axis is food inflation, 20%. And then the CPI on the left axis, 5.4. And probably the scariest number for the Chinese government is actually that number right there. It was 4.5% last month. They added almost a full percent to the CPI in January. That is very concerning. That rattles the global financial markets. And so that's where things get real dicey. Now, that was 6% back in 2010. But that's the number that the world financial markets are watching right there. And pork can move that needle, especially in China. I mentioned $2 billion a year. So we see the port slowdowns in China. This shouldn't have surprised us. Look at where they were a year ago. So a year ago, they bought about that much beef, pork, and poultry worldwide. This is 27,000 containers in December. They doubled the amount of containers coming into China from a year ago. So even without coronavirus, we had a pork problem. Here's the gap. There's the amount of pork they produce. There's how much they can import. I said, okay, I'm going to give them another 2.5 million tons of imported pork this year. That's how much that is. This is a gap that cannot be filled. All of the globally traded pork in the world is 8 million tons. They're going to increase imports by 2+ this year. Not enough, right? There's no way to fill this gap. 24.5 million tons is my estimate of that China pork gap. So let's look at the gap. There's our 24.5 million ton gap. So I go through the numbers and say, okay, they're going to import 2.4 million tons more pork. They're going to produce 2.5 million tons more chicken, beef. I go through all the math and say, I can get about 1/4 of that gap filled with everything. With buying, producing, everything they can do only fills 1/4 to 1/3 of that gap. What does the rest of the gap get filled with? Nothing. Nothing. There's nothing out there. There's no global supply. It's just not going to get filled. Which tells me those Chinese prices are going to stay very high for a very long time. Because that's what markets do with scarcity. They allocate product with price. And they're allocating that product with very high prices. That's going to continue for a long time in China. Here's my slide. Chicken is not the answer, right? That's a great tagline. Don't quote me on that. I might be speaking to the chicken industry one of these days. Chicken is not the answer. No, look at that chart. So you generally have a 5 RMB spread, 2 to 5 RMB spread between hogs and broilers. Hogs go through the roof. Look where broilers are today. I mean, if you've been to China, they really don't like chicken. They really don't. They just don't eat it much. Except for paws. They'll pay more for chicken paws than breast meat, dark meat, anything. They'll pay for paws. We'll send a lot of paws to China. We're already doing it now. But they don't want white meat. They don't even really like dark meat. It's just not, the price don't lie, right? They just don't like it. And they overproduced. When that price was going up right here, there were a lot of people that bought chicks and started raising broiler chicks. They probably overproduced a little bit, but look at that level. 5 RMB is where they are now on broilers. And that's in a scarce protein situation. Chicken's not going to fix this. Here's the real question. How and when do they recover? Well, the government's pretty optimistic about it, but the problem is all they've got is optimism. They've come out and said, we're going to recover. In fact, last week they published the Chinese #1 document, which is a big strategy document they put out. And in that document, they said, we're going to recover our swine herd by the end of 2020. We're going to recover. This year, we're going to recover. One of the Chinese guys I know said that ensures that their statistics will match their statement. Their statistics are going to show recovery this year. Now, the problem with that is price don't lie, right? Price don't lie. So we're going to see a recovery in the statistics. We're going to see inventories growing. That's going to all be published in the news. But prices are going to stay very, very high. They put out edicts to local officials. Do everything you can possible to keep away from pork price inflation. Ensure adequate supplies. Stop the declines as soon as possible. That's just good old Chinese heavy-handed communism here. Fix it. You guys at the local level, fix this. The news media has been ordered to write articles restoring confidence in pig farmers by reporting on the effectiveness of government policies and giving examples of successful recovery. That's published. They have ordered the media to write positive things. So when you see this stuff come out, and Reuters and Bloomberg and everybody's going to grab those stories out of China and say, hey, Chinese government says things are going pretty well. They're actually making progress. You're going to read that this year.
And think fake news.
Yeah, hashtag fake news, right? That's what it is. And we're going to read that and people are going to believe it. The futures market's going to trade it. The reality is the government has ordered those articles. Now, this was before this week. They were saying before normal supplies in 2021. And normal, they were saying, we're going to get to a 70% recovery. Well, 70% recovery means 30% of their consumption's imported. 30% of their consumption is 16 million tons. All of the traded pork in the world today is 8 million tons. So even if they were to recover to 70% in 5 years or 10 years, that still means global pork exports would have to double. And they would be taking all of it. So this China math is staggering when you think about it. There's going to be a lot of imported pork into China for years to come. So I won't read through this. This was out of their plan. If you go to the Dim Sum's blog, they translated China's plan to restore pork supplies, wrote an article on it. But they talk about all these things they're going to do. They're going to build demonstration farms, subsidize, ease up on the regulations. Get this. Collect manure at centralized sites for fertilizer. There's got to be some veterinarians here. That is not a good idea, right? That's a really, really bad idea. Collection points for diseased carcasses. Also a very, very bad idea. You read through this recovery plan, there's a lot of urging, promoting, and creating going on here. The reality is they have a major, major problem. And without a vaccine, it's a major problem. Even with a vaccine, it's still a pretty big problem. The problem is they claim, well, we're going to subsidize the big guys. The big commercial hog farms are going to expand. The backyard farms are going to go out of business, and we're going to fix this. Well, the big guys are only 15% of production. The small guys, 85% of their hogs come off of farms of less than 1,000 head. How big did those big guys got to get? About 800% of what they are now for this to happen. I don't think they're willing to commit the land and the resources to really increase those big guys. The other problem is structurally, the big farms, Muyan, Wen's, TechBank, those companies you hear about that are the big hog producers in China, almost all of them are just sow units. They're not finishing. Most of them contract with small farmers to do all the finishing. The majority of the finished hogs in China are finished on small farms.
Sir?
Yes?
Are they trying to backfill any of this gap with Beyond Meat or fake protein?
Good question. That's a great question. Yeah, are they trying to backfill this gap with fake meat, alternative proteins? Well, Beyond Meat would say, oh, absolutely, we're all over in China. I was at the CL Food Show last May in Shanghai, where it's a big global food show, and Beyond Meat had a booth there. They did have a booth there. But the meat industry had about 600 booths there. They like to say that's going to fill this. That's not going to fill this, I don't think. I don't know. The whole the fake meat thing, it's all about animal welfare and some of those issues that really are not issues in China. They're a long ways from animal welfare being a consumer issue. It's kind of like the story of when you're hungry, you only got one problem in the world. When your belly's full, you got a lot of problems in the world. And this is kind of one of those things we maybe are outsmarting ourselves a little bit on. It's kind of a first world problem that we're this fake meat thing. But China, I don't see any consumer social issues. Now, the fact is it's meat, and yeah, you can eat it instead of pork. I think that's decades away in China. Now, they do eat tofu, right? They're already eating soybean tofu and stuff in China, and that's a traditional thing, but what they want is pork. They really do. Will they succeed? Sure. eventually, with enough government support, they could create an entire new biosecure swine sector. Without a vaccine, yeah, that's not going to happen. In the next 10 years, probably not going to happen. You've got to restock 20 to 25 million sows to rebuild this sector. Where do you go buy 20 million sows? You can breed your market gilts, but has anyone tried that? What's your productivity when you just start breeding market gilts? Productivity drops, they estimate in China, 20-25%. The business model in China is this, though. We're gonna buy piglets, so these mid-size or small farmers, they're all small in China, they pool their money with their family and say, let's go finish some hogs. They go to the big guys, they buy some piglets. Those big guys are making money hand over fist because the profits on weaned piglets are hundreds of dollars a head. The mid-size guys, I'll buy them to finish. They pencil in a 50% death loss and they still make money because the profits are so high. And so as those hogs, if they start to break with ASF, they do the tooth extraction they talk about. They go pull the sick ones out and try and keep as many alive as long as they can. And you can have a pretty high death loss and everybody makes money. That's kind of the new business model. So yeah, they can produce a lot of sows, they can wean a lot of piglets, but they're just not finishing that many because the death loss is so high, but the profits are high enough to offset those big death losses. Outside of China, problems in Europe. Belgium's seen some success. They've been kind of successful, but they have been pretty draconian. They're out there hunting at night, they're trapping hogs, they're building fences, doing everything they can do, and they started with a very small outbreak. Germany is at serious risk. They now have cases in Poland 6 miles from the German border. The Germans are building fences. Have you ever tried to build a fence that'll hold a pig? I grew up on a cattle ranch. I'm a cattle guy. I grew up in Wyoming raising cattle. One year we started raising show pigs. We've raised show pigs for years, and I realized that's a different kind of world trying to fence pigs in. My son's here, Will, huh? We had pigs. I could be home in my home office working and see 5 black pigs run across the front lawn. And be like, I guess the fence didn't work. I would be back up there nailing and cussing, and they're tough to fence in. I've learned why you have concrete alleys. I've learned what that's about. But short of a concrete alley, fences don't work, and especially for wild boars. So what does the world look like if Germany gets ASF in one wild boar is all it'll take? One wild boar, Germany gets banned from the global markets. There's the map. There's the border right there. These were the cases they had in eastern Poland. These are the new cases in western Poland. That wasn't a wild boar jump. That was humans. Biggest vector of ASF movement around the world isn't wild boars, it's humans. But it's right there on the border. So what does that look like? Germany supplies 17% of the Chinese pork market, of the imports into China. They send 20%, they supply 20% of Korea's pork imports. Those are the two markets that would feel the pain the quickest if Germany were to pop with ASF. You take 20% out of Korea, 17% out of China. That's a problem. So, let's shift gears. Where's China in the pork markets? This is a question I get every week nonstop now. What the heck, Brett? You told us this thing was huge. You told us China was going to buy all this pork. Why are our prices so miserable right now? Well, there's a chart. So what I've done here, I've just put on the cutout. I put on the weighted average, which is basically the CME index, and then the cash hog price, which you guys all know. A lot of people don't, but the cash hog price is less than 2% of U.S. hogs. I have this conversation about 5 times a week with investment banks on Wall Street. Those guys call all the time. Tell me about prices. So I've had to go through this explanation of how hog prices work in the U.S. because they said, why are futures prices not the same as the cutout, vice versa? So if you look at this chart and look at those prices, what's interesting, here's October. Look how wide the spread is on those prices there in October. Let's go back to this October. Look how wide those prices get. Let's go back to this October. So there are times, look at that, October 16, how wide those were. This isn't abnormal. We know when we have capacity issues, and it's always in the fall. And so in the fall, those spreads get really wide. The producer that's selling hogs on a cash basis doesn't have much leverage when the packer's going, hey, I'm full every week. Here's what I'll give you. So this thing ebbs and flows. And when's it the tightest? Usually in the spring. Spring and summer is when those prices go back. This is really a measure of leverage between the guy selling the hogs and the guy buying the hogs. But you can see there are those prices. So here we had the cutout up in the 80s last into fall, November. We're now in the 70s. We're now lower than that a little bit on cutout. But you got to understand those are three different prices that all represent three different things. And what does futures trade? Futures trade's closer right here to the hog price. So here's where we're at. From October through now, and I just updated yesterday, it's actually 9% now. U.S. pork production from October through last week is up 9% year over year. 9% is a big number, right? 3% is sufficient, maybe a big number. 9% is just way too much pork. But yet we're sitting here the last week with the cutout 1% above a year ago. So we put 9% more pork on the market, and we've still got the cutout actually above a year ago. November, the cutout was up 26% during this big increase in production. Ham prices, even today, ham prices are 23% higher than a year ago, even after the break. Pork exports were up 17% in Q3, up 18% in Q4. Not November, sorry. Q4 was up 18%. So we started last year, pork exports through the first half of the year were down 5%. Second half of the year, pork exports are up 18%. So that put the year average at up 8%. China's having a huge impact on these markets. What would happen if we weren't shipping 8%, 9% of our production to China right now? It would be apocalyptic. It would be a disaster, total disaster. So China's stepped in. The problem is, like I said, well-anticipated events never happen in agriculture. With a futures market, well-anticipated events never happen. Now, I'm telling you, China's going to buy more pork than this. I think those shipments are going to step up. We've got to get through this backlog, and it may take a month. It may take 2 or 3 months to get through the backlog. So I tell you what I've been telling people for a year. Oh, it's going to get better. Just wait, right? Just wait a little longer. Sick of waiting. Give me patience and give it to me now. The hog market problem really is just too much pork right now. Now, the WASDE came out this week, the USDA WASDE forecast of annual production this year, next year. They showed 2019 pork production up 5%. They showed 2020 pork production up 4.5%. That is a huge amount of pork. Here's one factor, though, that's had an impact. China was shipping 20, 25,000, 30,000 tons a month of pork to China. Then they got banned. Remember that over those documentation issues in June? Where does 30,000 tons of Canadian pork go when they can't ship it to China? It goes to Korea. It goes to the U.S. It goes to Mexico. It goes into all of our markets. That has just reversed. That ban was lifted in November. Look at December. They shipped 26,000, 27,000 tons back to China. That's pork that wasn't in our market. That's 3% of U.S. production right there. So that had a 3% production impact, just Canada getting back to China. Taking that pork away from Mexico. That's when we saw that ham price rally in November, December. All of a sudden, all that Canadian pork that was going to Mexico started going to China. What about the Phase 1 deal? So the Phase 1 deal, China's committed to buy $12.5 billion more than they bought in 2017, which works out to about $32 billion, and then they tacked on plus $5 billion above that. So China's committed to buy about $37 billion of U.S. agriculture in 2020. They bought $10 billion last year. So they've got to nearly triple what they bought last year, and it's pretty hard to do that without soybeans. Now you could buy what? The entire U.S. soybean crop would be about 35 billion, somewhere around there. They could buy every bean we produce for 35 billion. They've got to get to 37 to match that commitment. Now, there may be some political posturing to this. The Chinese government committed to something with President Trump that really can't be measured until February of 2021 when we get the year-end trade data. Well, February 2021 is about a month after the inauguration. So maybe that was a little bit of a gamble by China, but I think if they're reading the news today, they better be a little nervous, because the news today would suggest that Trump is going to be the guy they're negotiating with in February 2021. Pretty tough to get to those numbers, but what this means is, okay, first of all, we start out, China has a huge gap, they need the pork, the price spread's enormous, everything they import works. Well, now they've just bet their economy in a poker game here. They've pushed their economy onto the table saying, okay, if we don't do this, you get to clobber us with tariffs. So now they have a massive incentive to buy not just lots of U.S. pork, lots of U.S. everything. So the incentive is there. Here's those pork exports. This is based off the weekly data. We hit 9.5% on the week of January 23rd. Now, what's interesting about that, that's what we were shipping to arrive after Chinese New Year. Even knowing that Chinese New Year is going to end, they're still saying we still need more, more, more. That's pretty positive. Here's my pork export forecast. Took me about a month after I made this. I didn't dare show it to anyone, but I looked at this and I said, that's what I think they're going to buy in 2020. And if you think that's a ridiculous amount, that's 11% of U.S. production. They were buying 9.5% of U.S. production before Tyson and JBS converted their herds over. So this is probably a conservative amount. Plus, they've committed. They've already committed, we've got to buy this, or the tariffs come back on. So the market's there, the political incentive has shifted. They keep their retaliation tariffs, but they said, we'll use tariff waivers. I would think they would start giving those tariff waivers to every company in China if they're truly committed to even try to meet those purchase commitments. So that says pork exports are up 33% next year. How good a news is that? Let's go through the math. So the key assumptions for my forecast, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It means this is what's got to happen for my forecast to work, is you can't have retaliation. Well, they've said we've got the waivers. That's not going to happen. The Chinese hog prices have to stay above 26 RMB. I don't think that's going to be a problem. No games. They can't delist plants. They can't try to manage imports. My forecast won't work if that happens. But they've already made the commitment now. We're going to buy, and we're going to buy big. So here's some math. 33% increase is a 2 billion pound increase of the pork export number. U.S. production, the WASDE says we're going to increase 2020 production up 968 million pounds. So if we increase basically 1 billion pounds, exports increase 2 billion pounds, then we can do that math, right? We're going to be 1 billion pounds less net. So net supplies decline about 1 billion pounds. That's 3.2 pounds per capita carcass weight, or 2.4 pounds retail weight. If exports go up 2 billion pounds and production only goes up 1 billion pounds, we take 1 billion pounds off, we do that math, and we say that's about a 5% per capita decrease. So we reduce the per cap supplies 5%. That says prices should go up 10%. 10% up on $60 hogs is $66 hogs. What I'm saying is you look at the futures market, well, before this last crash, and it maybe was a little overpriced, even if we export 30% more pork. That's what the numbers say. We've got to export more than what I'm saying to move this needle significantly. Now, beware, we may be wrong. Exports, one, could exceed far beyond what I'm saying, and they probably should exceed what I'm saying. But two, think about this. In 2014, pork supplies were only down 2%. That suggests a 4% price increase. Prices went up 25%. Markets aren't as predictable as we think, and if we have a 5% per cap supply decrease for pork, prices could increase far more than 9%, especially when this is a global event. This affects not just pork, it affects beef. The Chinese have basically cornered the southern hemisphere beef supply. They're buying everything they can. They committed under the Phase 1 deal to open to U.S. beef. We'll see where that goes. But they could be buying, if they start buying a lot of global poultry, U.S. beef, southern hemisphere beef, we could see this go higher. But just on a sheer This is a Steve Meyer verified number. I went through this with Dr. Meyer and said, where's my math wrong? And he says, yeah, 4.5%, 4.7% per cap supply decrease equates to a 9% price increase. Now, I scatter plotted that over years, and it's not a straight line. It's a shotgun blast. And I said, Steve, that means it could be anywhere from up 2% to up 30%. He says, yeah, that's probably true. So, those are the numbers. So one, if China keeps buying, if they buy 11% of production, we could potentially not see a huge price increase. But they could buy way more than that as well. So what this does, ASF drives waves of inflation over the world. And here's where we were. This was actually early January. The first wave of inflation was in China. All those domestic prices go up triple digits. Boom. Happened pretty quick. The second wave of inflation is everyone that can ship product to China. EU hogs up 45%. Spanish picnics, German hams, Brazil hogs, Brazil cattle, all of those up double digit real quick. That was the second wave of inflation. The third wave of inflation is everyone that doesn't have access to China that has a secondary impact. That would be like U.S. broiler prices, some of those things. And the last wave of inflation is all global protein. That may not happen till the end of the year. The U.S. is a little insulated from this for the obvious reasons. One, we increased production very quickly to offset what they're buying. And two, we had retaliation tariffs going on. And those two things really kept us out of that wave of inflation that some of these other countries felt. So what happens when those waves of inflation, what is the market telling everyone? Make more pork, beef, poultry, whatever it is. As prices inflate, markets react, producers react. We're pretty good at it. We react to profits that we don't even have yet, and we begin expanding, right? So where are the expansion opportunities? As the world says, as prices go up, and that signal's already been sent today, who expands? We kind of went through and tried to rank the top 4 global protein producers and say, who is best suited to expand? Who has the land? Who has the capital, permitting, feed, labor? Who has access to China? And you look at this and you go, well, Brazil's the clear winner. They have land. Their interest rates are way below where they were a year ago. They have permitting. They have feed. They have labor. They have access to China. The U.S., though, with the Phase 1 deal, we can turn that one green. If China's open for business, then all of a sudden the U.S. looks pretty good as well. Now, we talked about the pork expansion, what's going on. Have you seen what's going on in the broiler industry? We have built 11 large-scale poultry plants that are either built or being built now. Egg sets, broiler egg sets are up over 10%. The chicken industry is expanding very quickly, maybe too quickly. And so we have this big pork expansion, we have big poultry expansion. We're already doing this. So, wrap it up. Here's the answer, right? Do we have a vaccine or not? The news article came out. U.S. says it's got a promising African swine fever vaccine. We saw that news. Hey, this thing's working. It's effective. Big disclaimer here. I'm not a scientist. There's probably some scientists here that can explain this better. And if you do, feel free to jump in. Here's what one of these scientists told me. Those vaccine candidates, this was the Plum Island research, were grown on macrophage cells. That cell line cannot be used for commercial vaccine production. Adapting that to a suitable cell line is complicated and not guaranteed. Also note that USDA has not yet transferred this technology to a commercial partner to do the needed work ahead of licensing trials. Now the headline was, hey, we've got a breakthrough, we've got ASF vaccine. The reality is, well, we kind of don't yet, but we did have a breakthrough. I've had a lot of conversations with pharmaceutical researchers and said, what does all this mean? Most of them suggest that even if we crack the nut tomorrow, we're 2 years away from a viable commercial vaccine. That's too late for China. So we are a long ways away. We're still not there on an ASF vaccine. It's going to take time. Anybody, any comments? Like I say, I'm not a scientist, but okay. Here's the ugly question that's probably on your mind as much as anything. What if we do find a case? Export markets close instantly. All export markets, in my opinion, everybody closes. I don't care how high the Chinese hog prices are. We find ASF, they're going to close. They closed to Vietnam, they closed to Mongolia, they closed to every country that they gave ASF to, even with a pork shortage. Those markets close. Canada, Mexico, they close. Now, they may regionalize, but what's got to happen is you've got to have a few weeks for the USDA to be able to definitively say, here's the trace back, here's where the hogs went. Best case scenario, we got it isolated, it's under control. If we can make that statement within a few weeks, Canada and Mexico may regionalize and say, okay, we'll buy from other regions of the U.S. But barring that, we're closed. We have 23% too much pork overnight. Right now it's 27% too much pork overnight. If they find a case in Canada, Canada has 68% too much pork. If they found ASF in Canada and the world banned Canadian exports, their industry probably would not survive. Scary stuff, right? So whatever effort we can make to make this happen, to prevent this, is worth every dime we can spend on it. And I know MPPC and the Pork Board, Bill, these groups are, I'm sure you're not sleeping at night over this issue. And I'm sure you've got an office full of people that don't sleep at night over this issue. It is worth every effort we can make. It's worth every meeting. It's worth every dime. It's worth everything we can do. Because if we can stay clean, this is going to be fantastic. Now, I think the odds are decent that we stay clean. I think we have some measures in place. We're screening imports. We have more dogs in airports, all those things. The scary thing is if someone wants us to have this, it wouldn't be too hard. That's the scary thing. I'm not a sky is falling kind of guy. I think we have some good people doing the right things, and I think we have pretty good odds of staying clean. Many of the markets stay closed, absolutely. Massive culling is not the risk. Like I said, this isn't highly contagious. We're not going to lose our herd. We're just going to lose exports. So, key items to watch. That's the coronavirus hitting the world economy. I don't think that's going to happen. I thought that was kind of a funny thing. Like I said, you saw the numbers. The numbers still show pretty low infection rates. But that's definitely something to watch very closely. The China port issues, weekly pork numbers to China, those are going to be very critical to watch each week. The live hog prices, the weekly slaughter levels, and ASF spreading in China, beyond China, anywhere. I track this stuff every week and send it out in our alerts. 2020 outlook means we have the potential for high volatility. We have huge production. We have a huge foreign buyer that is not the most reliable buyer on earth. Volatility is here. Have a plan. Futures options premiums outweigh the risk of outright contracts. And you can see that in the market. You can look at hog futures and go, ASF doesn't even exist in the hog futures. They're not pricing any of it in. Well, go look at the options. June hogs, there's a 170 option trading. In the options, people are willing to pay a little premium or spend a little money to lay off risk in the options. And that may be a better opportunity. You hate to spend money on option premiums. But there is the risk. There's the risk of ASF here. There are people out there buying those really cheap, below the market calls in the nearby. Some of those, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you really, truly hedge the risk of ASF here, but you can buy some calls. Serious market risk into Q3, Q4. We built 4 new big-scale slaughter plants, and we filled them with hogs in about a year and a half. We look at what this expansion does into Q3, Q4 in packing capacity. We're going to be over capacity this fall. We were borderline capacity this last fall. There's some real risk of getting the hogs boxed this fall. And it's not just plant, it's labor, it's a lot of things. If we have any blips come along in fall, we could be in some real problems. We're banking on China to work this out, right? Potential for profits and expansion? Absolutely, there's potential for profits. But there will be expansion. And again, we're banking on China. Anything I missed? Any questions, thoughts? I'm wrapping it up here. Anything else? Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Brad, are you seeing any consumer trends in China going away from wet markets to a retail case? I know we tried it 4 years ago, slow to take, but I think just because everything going on from the health and biosecurity, that trend will change.
Yeah, so the question's about consumer trends away from wet markets to retail. And yeah, I think that's changing. I think it's been changing for years, but it's been changing pretty slow. I would say before ASF, probably 70% plus of all pork eaten in China was wet market pork. And there's retail pork, you see it, and they do a nice job with it. I think that will change through this. I think there will be more of that. The government's moving away, even with coronavirus. They're saying, we got to get these live markets out of the city. The live markets were built in or near the cities because it's a fresh, warm pork market. They didn't have refrigeration. I think that changes. I think that accelerates. You know, I don't know, 50-50, say, when do we hit 50% wet markets, 50% retail? That might be in the next 5 years. I think it's a slow go, but I think that's the direction they're moving. That's my guess. Maybe. Yeah.
Brett, I brought up a couple good points. You know, the approach to packing capacity here this fall. What do you hear? What do you? I mean, there's those plants, and many of them that could go to 2 shifts, and they have that kind of potential in front of them.
Yeah.
Do you hear anything on the labor situation? And then the other thing is that you brought up that we're within 6 miles of Germany. I've heard of 3 different areas right there. If that gets into Germany, brought up 20% into Japan and 17% into China.
20% of Korea, yeah.
Yeah, so that now changes that picture that you put up also. So
Yeah.
take that as.
Yeah, so capacity issues. Yeah, capacity isn't just infrastructure. Capacity is labor as well. And I think there have been some times here in the last 3 or 4 months we've been up against some labor capacity as well. And it's tough. I talk to these guys in the plants. It's not easy, is it, keeping plants moving? Labor's a real issue. Yeah, we have plants that can double shift. We have plants that can move to double shift. Problem is, as you double shift for China, you've got to have cooler capacity. And cooler capacity is a problem. You can't just pack fresh pork into boxes, put it on trucks, and freeze it on the way there. You've got to freeze it to get your certificate to export it. And so I know there's some investment. There was a news article this week in Meeting Place. Seaboard is doing a big expansion on their Guyman plant, adding freezing capacity. There's probably going to be more of that. But yeah, between labor capacity and freezing capacity, this is complicated. It's not as simple as it sounds to say, yeah, we can just ramp this up and go. It's complicated to truly expand capacity on existing infrastructure due to labor and freezing. And yeah, Germany, yeah, that's pretty daunting. Now we talk about, so say ASF jumps into Germany. The eastern Germany, western Poland is very dense for wild boars. You can look at wild boar density maps, very dense. The reality is, so once Germany has it, can they stop it? And where next? Does it end up spreading westward from Germany? You run the models, I mean the statistical models on a disease like this with no vaccine, and the models suggest that it ends up everywhere, ultimately. Eventually it ends up everywhere. There's no vaccine. The flow of goods and people around the world ensure that it goes everywhere. Maybe that's the case, maybe not. If that's the case, we want to be the last ones to get it right. That's the goal. Yeah.
That was going to be my question. I'm looking for a silver lining. I'm pretty sure the answer to this is no. But say we would be the last ones to get it. Is that slightly better, but still gruesome, right?
Slightly better. I guess that's a question. If everybody's got it, is it a trade barrier at that point? At some point, it doesn't become a trade barrier. You would think, right? At some point, it doesn't matter. We're not there yet. Even with the high prices in China, it would be a trade barrier. Absolutely. I mean, look at the political relationship. What would that do to our markets? It would drive markets to the floor. And what would China do? Step in and book a whole bunch of pork and then reopen maybe? I don't know. But I remember living through the BSE days with beef, and we said that the response was when Japan banned all U.S. beef, we were half of their beef imports. Beef imports were half of their consumption. We were a fourth of Japan's beef consumption. We found one imported cow from Canada with mad cow disease that never went through the food chain. She was killed and destroyed. And the response of the industry was, they need our beef. 3 years later, we were begging them to take beef. We said, we'll age verify, we'll jump through whatever hoop you have. 3 years later, begging them to take it. I mean, these issues are pretty sensitive. And China's very sensitive, yeah. At some point, maybe it doesn't matter, but I think we're a ways away from that. Yeah, go ahead.
Investing in pork facilities or production facilities in like Africa, Brazil, or anywhere else?
Yeah, does China invest in foreign pork facilities? I don't know of any Chinese investment in pork facilities in South America or Africa. There could be, but I sure haven't heard of any.